I'm going to do that again. Welcome, everybody, to the Carb Watch. This is the show where we offer weight loss advice. It's all things weight management. And I am your host, Ben Rogers, and I've got a special guest with me today, and Andrea Kendrick. Andrea, why don't you introduce us to just who you are, what you do, and we're gonna get into some weight loss wisdom today. I can't wait.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. I am a registered dietitian in the Knoxville area, and I have been in private practice for 10 years. I mostly deal with insurance at this point in time, working with patients with diabetes, high cholesterol, overweight, obesity. Also tap into some GI stuff as well with IBS, celiac disease, that sort of thing. And I also take in some athletes too. I love a variety, I guess, of clientele that I work with.
Yeah, so. And we're about a minute in, and before we click record here, you told me that you're easily bored, and I can see that you don't get bored in your job. You're all over the place in what you treat and who you treat, and you and I connected quite a bit on the athletic front. So tell me, to start off, for the people who don't know, what is the difference between a dietitian and a nutritionist?
Absolutely. So as a dietitian, my educational background has been that I've gone to school for nutrition, and I had to have a core group of didactic courses that would then make me eligible to do an internship. And in that internship, I had community rotations that I would do. So I might be at places like the health department, working with WIC or with food banks. I had a food service rotation, oftentimes in a hospital setting, getting a lot of exposure to like cardiac diets, diabetic diets, that sort of thing. And then a clinical rotation. So I was looking at each one of those disease states and having a concentration during that time. And then upon finishing that, I could take my registration exam. And then I do, as most medical professionals require, continuing education. So a nutritionist may or may not have that same kind of rigor in terms of their education and also the continuing ed that's required. So
super interesting. The whole, nutrition world is so fascinating to me. And I think, one of the big misconceptions is, around, within the weight loss, industry, health and wellness industry, is carbs and calories, what matters and what doesn't. And I know one of the things you wanted to talk about today is how carbs aren't created equal. There's some carbs you might want to stay away from, and some that you can consume. Let's get started with that. Like, what do you mean when you say all carbs aren't created equal?
Yeah, it's something that's been coming up a lot with me here with patients that may have prediabetes, and I might be working with them on a series of other maybe GI symptoms. And they're saying, hey, I thought I told you I was pre-diabetic and you're still feeding me carbs. And they're not recognizing that I am having them on a lower carbohydrate diet. But I think we get this misconception, and it might be from the ketogenic diet, that maybe they should be eating 30 grams of carbs, which is really too low for most people unless they are really doing that ketogenic diet. So I wanted to educate just the general public, just because, like I said, it's been coming up a lot here lately with people, that not all carbs are created equal. We have to consider, is there fiber associated with those carbs? Is there added sugar in those carbs? And what about gluten? Because that's also another misconception. I find people saying, well, it's gluten-free. And it's almost like they think it erases the fact that it's providing carbohydrates. So I want to delve in a whole lot more and talk about the different types of carbohydrates.
It sounds like there's a formula in there, because one thing I hear a lot is macros, and I know a lot of that's about taking the carbs you're consuming and then subtracting out maybe fiber. Is that kind of where you're going at when you're talking about all carbs aren't created equal?
Yeah, you're getting close, and we didn't actually talk about this, and I kind of love that you're kind of guessing me. But I actually have a little rule, and I do it as if carbs are the largest number when we're looking at a food label. I always look at I look at total fat, total carb, and protein. And if carbs are the largest number, which so many things are, even things that we thought were proteins, I would like 1 gram of dietary fiber for every 50 calories. That's my little formula that I challenge people to.
So what do you mean by dietary fiber? That's just fiber that's in the food that you're eating?
Yes. So on the food label, there'll be total carbohydrates, and then there's an indentation on the food label, and then it says dietary fiber. So pretend there was 20 grams of carbohydrates, and then it said dietary fiber 5, and then there might be a sugar category for naturally occurring or added sugars. And that would all be accounted for under that total carbohydrate number.
Okay, so you're looking at that dietary fiber number and then the total calories, and then you're trying to keep a certain ratio between the two?
Yes, absolutely.
And say that ratio one more time.
For sure. My minimum is 1 gram of fiber for every 50 calories. So if a food, product had 150 calories in it, we would want at least 3 grams of dietary fiber in there. So things like Triscuits, that passes, honestly. It has 3 fibers into 120 calories. Corn tortilla chips might have 1 gram of fiber in 160 calories. So just to give you a couple examples.
So are you looking at fiber as much as you are carbs? Because, I think, one thing that, for me at least, is easy to tell if, man, I ate a lot of carbs today. Whereas, I don't think much about the amount of fiber I'm eating. And yet I know, fiber is so important to me feeling good. But kind of go through what you mean by watching fiber versus watching carbs, and then you got that total calorie number.
Well, and you kind of had alluded to it too when you're saying, okay, you can take the total carb and subtract the fiber from it and get the net carb there, right?
Okay.
So that's kind of where I'm going with this. There's a brand of bean pasta, for example, that has 20 grams of carbs, 13 of which are fiber. So you're only going to net 7 carbs. I want people meeting that 1 gram of fiber per 50 calories as a minimum, but truthfully more so exceeding that, so that their day looks like they're definitely beating that 25 grams of fiber recommendation for females and 38 grams of fiber for men, as on the daily needs there. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So let's go over, the difference between what a man should be consuming and what a woman should be consuming. And then, kind of talk to me about, what does that mean for weight loss? I understand, from a low carb standpoint, that's putting my body in a position where I'm burning fat versus burning sugar. Is that kind of, what your goal is when you're counseling, patients on, getting this net carb number to be lower?
Yes. And the other caveat of that too is, I don't think I specifically have said this, but they are on a lower carb. I am recommending a lower carb diet as well anyways. So I tend to be one that's going to incorporate more protein, more heart healthy fat, lower carb. And then of those carbs that I am recommending, making sure that those carbs certainly all do have fiber in them.
Yeah. And I think, based on, and again, I'm super, lay person here, but the way I'm interpreting that is that the net carb number is more important than just the regular carb number. And so really what I'm wanting to do is look for carbs that have fiber in it to bring that net number down. And am I kind of on track here?
Yeah, you're 100% on track. Absolutely. So if somebody ate 200 grams of carbs on a given day, but 50 of them are fiber, then they've netted, 150 grams of carbs, so on that day.
Let's get real practical. You're finding this information just on the food label. You're looking at total number of carbohydrates, and then you see the dietary fiber. And for the listeners out there, what you're doing is you're just subtracting that top number from the dietary fiber number.
Yes.
Super interesting. And can you give us that net carb number you're suggesting people get at or try to get at when they're going on a low carb diet?
I actually am not offering a net carb one. Certainly keto does offer like a net carb of like 30, but I base it off of macro percentages.
Okay.
So based off the total calories. So if we are looking at doing a lower carbohydrate diet because of like insulin resistance, for example, 40% of the total calorie would come from carbohydrate. So I'd have to do math to figure out, an arbitrary number of where we're starting in terms of calories. But 40% is the number of total calories I would recommend for carb if we're talking about a low carb, insulin resistance kind of diet.
Let's dig in there a little bit more because, so many of our patients and, the audience listening here today, and so much of what we preach is insulin resistance and watching that insulin number versus just your blood sugar number. Can you give us, just some tips on what your thoughts are on insulin resistance and how to become less insulin resistant?
I would certainly start off by having quality carbohydrate as that main one, because we are going to have carbohydrates coming in. We oftentimes think, because it's gluten-free or because it's organic, it takes away or makes it an okay choice or a healthier choice. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it has fiber in it. Oftentimes the gluten-free pasta noodles are rice-based or potato-based, and they're certainly lacking in fiber unless they are a bean-based version of like the pasta noodles, for example, or completely avoiding the pasta and doing whole foods like sweet potatoes, beans, that sort of thing. So I start certainly with having quality carbohydrate in there. And I also really pay attention to the added sugars, even if it is what we call cleaner sugars like honey. It is still 16 grams of added sugars. So being aware of these sources of carbohydrates that are lacking in fiber.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I know that's going to bring so much value to the people listening today, because that is something we talk a lot about is insulin resistance. And can you go in just a little bit further? You said, healthy fats, and is there, certain things you highly recommend for people wanting more healthy fats in their diet?
Yeah, I certainly recommend they be ones that are low in saturated fats. So these are going to be things like the nuts, the nut butters. I encourage nut butters that don't have, sugars added into them, obviously. So basically just like mashed up almonds, mashed up peanuts, whatever nut butter we're going with. Avocados being a beautiful source of those heart healthy fats. Your oils, right? Avocado oil, olive oil, there's grapeseed oil. There's so many oils out there anymore, right? Those being like my main sources there. And then your seeds, of course, I've got the seeds, flaxseed, chia seed, hemp, all those kind of things being great seed sources. So
I've got to ask you, because this is something that we've talked a little bit on the podcast is sourdough bread versus, other forms of bread in terms of, there's still carbs in sourdough bread, but it being a better source of if you have to have a sandwich or anything like that. What's your thoughts on sourdough bread? I know that's just a totally random thing that I'm asking you, but it was top of mind for me when you were talking about good carbs.
Yeah, absolutely. From a fiber standpoint, it honestly is one that is lower in fiber. So it is one that I recommend for my IBS type people, my gastroparesis patients, that sort of thing when it comes to the sourdough bread, because it is a lower fiber source. And I guess that's something to consider in this conversation about carb. There are some people that high fiber is not appropriate for. And it's some of those GI type of conditions.
Yeah, it's so fascinating because, I feel like, fiber is just something that I haven't, we haven't talked much about on the podcast. And based on, what you're saying, it's a really important number to look at when you're just looking at what you're eating and what you're taking in on that day, especially if you're trying to become more intentional with what you're eating, which is really what we're trying to do here on the Performance Medicine Audio, is just educate people on how to be more intentional with what they're eating. And I'm telling you that one piece of advice about looking at the top carb number and then that dietary fiber number is really important. And I heard a term last week about budgeting your carbs, and I'm sure you can connect. Have you ever used that term out of curiosity? How you use your carb budget for the day?
Yeah, absolutely. And I kind of look at it more as like I'm big on consistency, whether it's protein intake or carb intake. I don't want it to be that, breakfast had a small amount of protein or a ton of carb, and then lunch was, a big protein and just a little bit of carb. more about consistency throughout the day is really, really important to me when it comes to kind of thinking of that budget of how to spend the amount of carbs you've been given, right? So we're not backloading them all into the evening and just going to bed on those, right? Well, I met the carb goal, I kept it under the number, but they weren't evenly distributed, and you could still be having those same insulin responses, right? If you're taking in 100 grams of carbs for some reason at dinner time, right?
So you're saying consistency, not necessarily in the foods you're eating, but in those percentages and, and the budget, for lack of a better term. So just making sure that throughout the day, you're keeping consistent with, your net carb number, your, your protein and healthy fat number. Can you even look at that?
So the way that I do it, because it sounds like we have a million things to track now. I usually set my client patients up with a MyFitnessPal account. And so I get them their target calories. I set their macro percentage for fat, carbs, and protein. And then on the meals, maybe they're doing a breakfast, a snack, a lunch, a snack, a dinner. Maybe that's kind of their meal pattern there. I'll make it say breakfast, and then I'll give them a target calorie goal, a target protein goal. And then for my ones that I'm monitoring carbs on, I'll give them a target carb goal, so that on each one of those eating times, they're seeing if they're getting close, right? Within like a 5 to 7-ish kind of range when it comes to those numbers. So that when they go back and look at it and see, okay, this is my usual breakfast. Okay, this is great. This is meeting the protein, but I'm not starting off maybe I need to have a little bit more carb here, because I'm certainly making up for it later in the day by having my 2:00 crash and I'm having a bunch of carbs or whatever it may be. So they can easily track that through MyFitnessPal and see that. And it also then shows their fiber at the bottom. So they can see, okay, what's my total carb number? What's my fiber? And just kind of subtract that out very easily. So
super fascinating. How much emphasis are you placing with your clients on how they're feeling? So not only with, when you're setting them up with MyFitnessPal and tracking these numbers, are you also kind of having them track, okay, I really felt good at this calorie count, at, this net carb count? Is that something that, because I know that it could be misleading at the beginning if you're not used to a certain, nutrition plan or diet. What's your thoughts on that in terms of tracking, okay, this made me feel good, this made me feel bad?
Yeah, I kind of jump back to some GI things. A lot of times people, once they start eating a better diet, they're like, I'm less bloated. You know what? I am having better energy. I'm not having that 2:00, 3:00 crash like I used to. And they start to attribute it to the foods that they're eating and the combination of nutrients that are there, part being fiber, part being protein, and part being fats. So I certainly do go on feelings. And then if it's an athlete or a regular exerciser, I also say, how did your workout feel? Did you have good energy? Did you feel like you kind of crapped out, halfway through, whatever it was? And so certainly having some of those kind of descriptive kind of feel how they're feeling overall. So.
Yeah. I love that. Just, it's so simple, and yet so many of us overlook, man, if I'm not feeling that great, what did I eat, 2 hours ago, 2 days ago, or, et cetera. It's just, excuse me. It's so fascinating. Now,
Absolutely.
Okay, I know we're running out of time here, but in terms of like for the people who are, wanting to go on a diet or change their nutrition plan up a little bit, one thing I know about you is you believe so much of this is personalized and everyone's unique, and we're right along in the same lines there at Performance Medicine. How do you go about, choosing, what the right plan is for you from a personalized standpoint?
Right, absolutely. So I start first with what their goals are. I feel like most of what I end up seeing is weight loss, but I certainly can see weight gain, and weight gain would be a completely different macronutrient set than, weight loss. But I start with what their goals are. Hey, I want to come off metformin. Hey, I want to lose weight, whatever it may be. And from there, I personalize it, are you one that likes to prepare food? I need to understand where they're actually coming from, because there's a lot of different diets that are out there that they can pull off the internet, but they're just not catered to them. Maybe there's ingredients or food items in there that are like cottage cheese or something, and they're just not going to eat it just kind of due to the texture, or the calorie range just might be way too high or way too low for an individual. So I do resting metabolic rate testing to determine an individual's calorie needs for weight loss, and feed them to that range, and then try to work with as close to the wheelhouse of foods that they're working with as possible. But the things I'm usually trying to push in are vegetables, because it's the thing that most of us don't do a good job with, right? And they're not very convenient. And they usually need something else to them to kind of make them enjoyable. So I'm usually trying to get more vegetables in there.
I love that. You cannot get enough veggies, and I'm a huge fan. They're so hard for me to do because I'm such a big eater-outer, for lack of a better term.
Eater-outer. Love it.
But I'm totally with you on there. And I want, for the people out there who want to lose weight, let's, one big final piece of advice, let's round it back to, all carbs aren't created equal. For the people who are trying to lose weight out there, what's your advice around the all carbs aren't created equal? And we'll end the podcast there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to go back to that fiber rule, because if you really start looking at the food label and you see how like 90% of the food in the stores are carbs, you're going to be surprised, number one. Two, you're going to see how much added sugar is in things. So if you use that fiber rule, it's immediately going to whittle down you to food sources that are whole foods for the most part, or processed foods that are with a really, really small ingredient list. So that's my number one thing, honestly, is get out there, fiber test your pantry, and make sure there's 1 gram of carb per 50 calories, or be educated that the beans that you thought were proteins are actually a carb, so that you're kind of learning a little bit more about food. So
I love it. Fiber test your pantry. I love that. That is amazing advice, Andrea. This has been Andrea Kendrick on the Carb Watch. Andrea, real quick, how can people find you? I certainly want you back on the podcast, so I hope that we can set up something as soon as we get off here. But tell us how we can find you.
Yeah, if you just want to go to integrative.rdknox.com, I have myself and one other dietitian, and most likely one of my other ones will be coming in back off maternity leave, or just Google even Integrative Dietitians Knoxville. And you can find us. You can schedule online. We try to make it as easy to do it yourself on the computer as possible. So.
And Andrea Kendrick, thank you so much.
Yeah.
This has been such a fun talk for me, and there's been so much weight loss wisdom in here. I can't wait to go back and scour through the tape, and we're going to pick out some gems for the people listening on the podcast or on YouTube. Guys, this has been the Carb Watch. I am your host, Ben Rogers, and we look forward to seeing you guys next time.
Thank you so much.